Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Gioia, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at Viewless Wings. Mike Lala is a poet and performance writer living in New York City. He is the author of The Unreal City, Tupelo Press 2023, and Exit Theater, Colorado Prize for Poetry 2016. Several chapbooks, including Points of Return, Ghost Proposal 2023, and a contributing translator to Tales of Dionysus, University of Michigan Press 2022. Lala's installations, performance, and libretti, including Whalefall 2021, Madeleine, Tell Me What It Was Like 2020 with Iris McCluggan, Oedipus in the District 2018-19, and Infinite Odyssey 2018. Mike, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Excited to discuss your book, which was fascinating to read and reread. The Unreal City opens with a series of stream of consciousness style poems with disorienting enjambment and surprising uses of white space. What are some of the poets who influenced your style?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I would say, in a sense, the most important poet in my writing life was my mentor in undergrad, Diane Wachowski. My poems don't have a lot in common with hers anymore, but I often reread her books, and I'll always find phrasing or lines where it's just that was so important to me, and I see the way that I construct lines and think about phrasing and think about imagery in a way that really just comes directly out of her instruction. But in terms of contemporary poets that are really important to me, I mean, I think, a few people, I would say, Jory Graham was really important to me for a long time. And thinking about the line and movement around the page and thinking as the way that thought and feeling come together to create an experience for the reader. I also spent some time studying with Anne Carson and Yusuf Komunyakaa, who are both really important to me in grad school. Yusuf was my thesis advisor. And I would say probably one of the most important poets to me today is Nathaniel Mackey, who I think is in some ways doing work syntactically, narratively, musically that is kind of set apart from anything else that I've read. So those are some people. And then I think in terms of this book, The Unreal City, I mean, obviously it has, if you've gone through the references at the end of the book, it takes a lot from high modernist poems of urban experience. So there's plenty of Eliot in there, and there's a ton of a poet named Hope Mirrlees, who was a poet and sci-fi writer who lived in Paris in the early 20th century and who was published by Virginia and Leonard Woolf on Hogarth Press. So, in a sense, I look to that era of poetry, which I think that era of history forms a kind of analog to ours, just in cultural, technological sense. And I think the poetry coming out of that era was grappling with the ways that economy, modes of production, and culture were changing in really big ways. And we're kind of living in a moment like that now. So I often will go back to that era to see how people navigated thinking through the ways the world was changing.
There's no question that to write wonderful poetry, you need to read wonderful poets. It's just a critical piece of continuous learning, and also finding poets I find that make me a little jealous in a good way, where I see what they've done. And a poet that I interviewed a couple of years ago on the podcast, Carmen DiBiase, is incredible at form. And in particular, he wrote a series of Shakespeare-inspired sestinas, and a sestina is a brutal form, and it inspired me to find an opportunity. It took like a year, but it just put this spark in me to find a way to do what he did seem to do so effortlessly. So yes, reading other wonderful poets is something that you have to consider as a critical part of continuously learning. Absolutely. Well, building on that question, when talking to Safia El-Hilo last year, we deep dived into her use of the ampersand and had a terrific discussion about that. In the poem Danny Isle and in other poems, you introduce unexpected line breaks where the enjambment is at the apostrophe pushing the S to a new line. The poem's opening is one example. 40,000 expense report this month's exchange rate, my dream of a unified and standardized, where months is enjambed at the apostrophe. Talk about how you incorporate form choices like this into your poetry, which is quite unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of the poems in the center of this book, like what I wanted to offer to a reader was like a sort of experience of like walking alongside me through the city and sort of like absorbing the sort of like changing landscape and all of the dynamism that's like inherent in downtown New York. You know, there's like big catalogs of stores or objects or things happening. There's a lot of like engagement with like a phone or a computer. And there's engagements with like other people verbally or looking at them or being seen by them, etc. And in terms of like the lines themselves, the way a poet breaks a line, it doesn't like force a reader to read something a certain way, but it sort of facilitates a certain type of reading. And so when there's an unexpected break, I find that as a reader, like my mind wants to get to the next line more quickly because I want to understand or like resolve the unresolved line. And I think that when the line is resolved and then it breaks and then there's another meaning that's inherent as if you're using the possessive and you break before the apostrophe and then like, so you have like a noun, month, and then possessive, this month's exchange rate. Basically, like you have this like opportunity to like resolve an idea and then be like, oh no, it's not resolved here. We're going to continue. So there's this sort of winking sense of everything that you think you know is constantly in flux. And that is like kind of like the experience of being, you know, downtown at 5 p.m., getting out of work and like trying to get home.
Absolutely. No, I think that that's where poetry and prose are so distinctly different, is that with poetry, you can radically influence the interpretation and meaning or multiple meanings through how you visualize the individual letters even on the page and use of white space. I thought that your book does that very effectively. Well, the poem 1982, which you'll recite later in this episode, is infused with a collage of cultural references. One example: a mini Mentmore 1855 estate sold 5 years back to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Transcendental Meditation 501c3 Foundation Maharishi, which hosts the English glam band Roxy Music on location filming promo for their single Avalon. It stars an 18-year-old Sophie Ward and singer Brian Ferry. I had to pause at this point and rewatch the video for Avalon, and actually caught Roxy Music on their supposedly final or maybe anniversary tour just a few months ago. I hadn't seen the video in years, which ended up perfectly setting up the next portion of the poem. How do you approach the inclusion of cultural references? What are you looking for in a cultural reference to complement a poem?
Yeah, I mean, this poem is a really good, this is a good example for this question. So the main part of the poem is about like a painting that I would have painted if I'd become a painter. But I'm not a painter, I'm a poet. So it's sort of imagining this kind of large painting that's populated with like various cultural figures, everything from like George Washington, Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, to the Terminator or Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And I was kind of like trying to work through or think through, this was in like, I think 2016 or 2017. I was trying to think through the ways that the logic of conspiracy makes associations and then like intuits meaning out of those associations, even if there really is no connection between things. So I was thinking a lot about like the 2016 election and like a lot of the conspiracies that were like kind of floating around on the internet during that time. The poem like something was wrong. Like the formally like the poem like didn't gel, and I didn't know why that was. And I went to Colorado to do a reading for my first book, Exit Theater, and afterwards I was like hanging out with some of the students, and I was like really into that song Avalon at the time, and I had sort of like been thinking about that music video. It was just like a crazy weird music video where like Brian Ferry falls in love with this woman and they like dance around this castle that is an estate that was owned by the Rothschild family, who are like the subject of many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. Now it's like a golf course, right? I was like, oh, this is the thing that can just go in the poem and it will like pull all of these other ideas together, because there's like this like scene with a lot of movement and this like really like solid cultural reference that has its hand in a bunch of conspiracies, and like it just feels like of this moment in this weird way. Also, like Brian Ferry has this history of horrible kind of right-wing politics, so it just like kind of like it was like the thing that I was looking for. And it also like it kind of gave like another level to the impossibility of the painting that I didn't paint by just like sticking a music video into it, which is like, you know, obviously like physically impossible. So it was just like this thing, like, and I often find this when I'm writing, I'll write a poem and I'll be like, something isn't right here. And what it needs is like, it needs to be like broken formally by like a new element that ties everything together. And for that poem that was all about conspiracy and regret and like a life not lived, a profession not, or like a calling not followed, particularly in that time where people were like sort of mourning the results of this election that didn't go as everyone expected. It was like this music video, which in some ways, like it touches on conspiracy. It touches on like weird British white imperial fantasy. This band like comes out of a very particular like moment in history, and they have like this like kind of like particular politics that relates to this moment. That was like the thing that just felt like, oh, like this pulls it together.
Very cool. So it's really interesting to hear the backstory of the painter that wasn't, or the painting painted by a painter that never ended up painting. I love that. That's really cool. Well, the core of this book is a long work of poem spanning over 50 pages and accompanied by 173 footnotes. Before discussing specific elements of the poem, how did this poem evolve from an initial idea, and how did you approach revising and editing the poem, which can be very challenging with long poems? And I say very challenging because there's a risk that you edit the beginning of it and the ending of it to the expense of the middle.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So work a poem, I started writing this poem in, I think it was 2010. I moved to New York from Michigan in 2009. And it was kind of a rough time. I didn't have a job. I just kind of moved to New York after undergrad, and I was sort of slumming around and not really writing very much. And I was in this moment where I was, okay, you know, just spoke about my mentor, Diane. I need to like figure out a new way to write that's not, you know, apprenticed to her. But my writing practice was like very inconsistent because my life was really a mess. And so like one of the things that I was doing was just accruing lines, references, quotes from other poems that I had read, quotes from things that I had heard or overheard on the street. And I was sort of just bringing them into a document, or like maybe just like an email to myself, and, you know, arranging them. That sort of built up, and then I would like write lines to connect everything. And I just did that for years. I did it probably for like 7 or 8 years. At that point, I had this poem. And it was this mishmash of many quotes from many books, my own writing, and then a bunch of things like overheard from being on the street, being on the subway, etc. I had read that poem, Paris 1919 by Hope Merlis, which is also like, it doesn't have references to other poems, but it has like a lot of observation of the world, the incorporation of like signage and that sort of thing. And so I was sort of like modeling the poem after that. And I just like slowly wrote it, broke it down, rewrote it over like a decade. And at some point it was like, no one's ever going to publish this poem because it's, like you said, it's like 50 pages long, but it came together very slowly. And then people would pick up the book and they did an amazing job laying it out. The typography is like really intensely particular. I have to say, like, the beginning and the end came together pretty quickly. And it really was that the middle, like, to go back to your question, that was like so hard to get through, because the poem was actually like quite long. It was even longer, and I really had to like cut it down to like get moving. But yeah, it was just honestly like it was a decade long process, and it feels like it's like there's something of like me, like when I was just figuring out my own poetics there, and then there's like all of this work that like became the work that like got me to this point in my life.
Well, part one of Work a Poem ends with this beautiful phrase: time clicks on with a pump of blood, slips between moments, made of a dry down musk. One slick red smile tears my clothes. The train bolts in, and I exit, turn the corner, stalling in a seam. As is the case in many phrases in this long poem, as you've touched on, smile tears my clothes is a footnoted reference to Russian poet Marina Tashvataeva, the poem of the end. The frequent references to and phrases from other poems reminds me of William Burroughs' cut-up method, which was discussed in my interview with songwriter Daniel Ash last year. What's your advice for other poets that are considering including a tapestry of references to other artists and poets?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any advice. What I would say is, I think in general, for every book you write, you should read 1,000 books. That's kind of don't play the game unless you really want to play. But in terms of, my own reason for doing this, I think, we touched on this a little bit, where like there's a moment in the early 20th century that feels historically analogous to our moment now. And so like one of the ways I wanted to like approach the sort of rapid change, the rapid sociocultural and technological change we're in at this moment, is to look to the past and the ways that people have done this before, and the ways that people have thought through it before, and the ways in particular that poets have thought through it. I also like in the time that I was writing this poem, I think there was a conversation happening about appropriation that was like at once necessary and also often like kind of dumbed down and like not particularly nuanced. And so I wanted also to like be formally in conversation with that conversation, but to like affect my own appropriation of historical sources in like an ethical, like highly diligent, referenced way. And formally, I think what that also does is like sort of point to the way that we live in a very hypertextual world, where any sort of text that we encounter is like hyperlinked to other texts online. And like, so like, at least in our experience of digital text, like our digital content, it's like in this like net or web of like relation to everything else. And that, in a sense mirrors the way that we as people and like thinkers are in relation to other people and other thinkers and other thoughts. And it sort of like affects this like web of interrelation through the poems.
Well, the military-industrial complex surfaces multiple times and in different ways throughout the Unreal City, from death count posts of @DroneStream to companies spewing forth into the occupying forces' mouths. That's a terrific line. You also draw stark contrast between Western privilege and the challenges faced by many countries. How do you approach incorporating your point of view into your poetry while avoiding preaching, although sometimes preaching can be the right thing to do too?
Or what makes preaching boring is, a kind of didacticism where you're like telling people what to do. And like, I'm not interested in telling people how to live their lives. Like, I'm interested in like rendering my view of the world in an interesting way that feels compelling to like consider for a reader. Again, like I think there for a long time, during the writing of this poem, there was a continuation of a long conversation about like the role of politics in literature, which I just thought was like kind of a stupid conversation. Like people would be like, don't put politics in literature. You're going to alienate your readers, or like, it's not the place for it, or whatever. But for me, like I'm not interested in like trying to convince someone of my viewpoint. Like I'm interested in like rendering what I see going on in the world and letting it be there, because we're not seeing the same perspective on world events, but we're all seeing the world events going on. You might not agree with me on what's happening in Gaza right now, but you're definitely seeing something of it. So my strategy there is like, put it in the poem, like let it be seen. Because ultimately, like as artists, we don't have control over what people think of our art, or if they think it's ethical, or like if they think we're right. Like all we can do is put something in front of people and let them have a reaction to it. And that's the magic of what art or literature is like the interaction between a viewer and the text or the piece or whatever it is. So my poems just try to like incorporate that part of the world, or that part of history, that part of current events, because they are happening in the world.
I love the way you phrase that. We are all seeing the same things, but how we interpret them and our belief system and everything is different. If you focus on what you are seeing, then it takes you a step removed from trying to convince somebody or preach them, which, yeah, I agree. But being overly preachy, it gets pretty boring and uninteresting. And it's too closed. Like, poems are open, not closed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of poetry lately has tried to like enact its politics by this very like personal connection to subject matter, which is fine, but I'm not really interested in that. It doesn't matter what I think. Like I'm not so narcissistic as to think that like people should care about like my personal views or my personal feelings about world events or anything else. It's just like, let's just look at this together, because it is happening in the world. That's a really interesting way to approach it, because then it leaves room for the reader to have their own reaction to it.
Yeah. Well, in the long sequence where you collage images of the city and search for a hollow phrase to capture its meaning, you format words and phrases in numerous ways, all capitals, italics, centered, staggered. The sequence is particularly striking on the page. How do you approach the visualization of your poetry, how it actually just looks on the page, and how does that visualization affect the words you choose when you're revising and editing?
Yeah, so I think it depends for every poem. When we're talking about this long poem work, what I wanted to do was, as we discussed, there are many references. I think you said 173. I actually didn't count them, to various texts. But there are like two texts in particular that are really important to this poem. One is Hope Merle's 1919 poem Paris, which is sort of a trip through Paris, just like this is a trip through downtown New York. And then there's Dante's Inferno. And so like what I was looking for was a sort of, downtown New York is like the, arguably one of the major centers of global capitalism and the cultural center of the premier imperial state, the United States. And you don't have to agree with me, in that characterization, I guess, but that's how I think of it. And so in a sense, like, New York is like a sort of glittering hellscape to me, where like everything is like beautiful and fancy, and that facade sort of hides like the violence that is enacted in service of economic domination. So I wanted to use Hope Merle's poem Paris as sort of a model for moving through the city. And that's why like her lines are sort of integrated into the main body of the text that goes down the left side of the page. And then I wanted sort of misuse or bastardize Dante as a guide through the inferno of downtown New York. And so his language and Virgil's language, like through Virgil's Georgics, which is another like didactic poem that's really important to this, is sort of like centered in the middle of the text. So you sort of bounce between like experiencing the cityscape on the left and then like being guided through it or having that cityscape commented on in the center.
Well, one more question before I turn the mic over to you. Near the end of Work, a Poem, you reimagined November Cotton Flower by Jean Toomer, interleaved in an intriguing way with a collage of references and samples. You write, "Another war is coming. The winter's grown warm. Corn aborts, seas rise, land loses form. Clean air, scarce as any snow, vanishing. Every branch, so pinched and slow, fails in its functions. Carbon spikes, pest-fighting toil causes streams to take poison from soil. Dead bees found everywhere." That sequence is one of my favorite in the entire book, by the way. Your book, just to kind of to lean in on this theme that I've been talking about, reminds me in many ways of the Beastie Boys album Paul's Boutique.
Oh, thank you.
Which employed hundreds of samples to create something new. I think at the time it was orders of just when sampling and paying for samples and rights clearing and all this was, was not terribly formalized. So they had a lot of headaches getting all the samples cleared for that piece of art. What advice do you have for poets considering a form of poetic sampling in their work and maybe some of the logistical challenges of what you can reference, what you can't? I have a poem that where I was going to include a snippet from Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin and researched it a bit and went, pulling a verse could be problematic. Not that anyone's going to care about my book, but if they did, it gets dicey with music lyrics. So I ended up referring to it in another way. What did you learn going through that experience? Because this just wasn't one poem; it was a 50 pages worth. So I think that there's something about your style that you probably learned. So I've got a lot of questions folded in there, but basically walking away from having created this really extraordinary long poem, how has that kind of changed you going forward?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the logistics of using other sources, I think like there are legal frameworks for fair use that you can like look up. There's a lot of gray zone there, but I think like in general, like sort of fastidiously referencing your quotations, not just like openly stealing, is wise and the ethical thing to do. And the other thing that I did in particular was like none of those quotes are actually direct quotes. I changed everything so that everything, but I changed a lot of the phrasing, or I would change like verbs and nouns to fit into the poem in particular places. So they're not actually like 100% straight pilfered from these texts. They're updated or deturned for my own purposes. Yeah, like in terms of like how it changed me, I mean, going back to this thing of like read 1,000 books for everyone you write, part of writing is being in conversation with the authors that you've read and the way that you've experienced literature as a writer and as a reader. And so like when I wanted to have a formal engagement with this question about appropriation and use, I also wanted it to feel a sort of homage to these writers that were really important to me. And then I thought did the work of articulating their very confusing time. And that's the work that poets can do again now in the early 21st century. That's why so many of them come from that era of high modernism. Jean Toomer is a good example. And I think like what it points to is as people, as living things, we're in interrelation with the rest of the world in porous ways. Like we're not set apart from the natural world. We're not set apart from each other. Like that's sort of an illusion of language and of philosophy. As readers and writers, we also are not writing or thinking separately from other people's writing or thinking. we're building on it, we're in relation to it, whether we remember that this idea is related to her idea or not, you know? I wanted the poem to make it clear that like it was in relation to all of those things, and that I as a writer owe my ideas, my being, my way of writing to like many people who've been writing.
Perfect. Well, that's a wonderful way to transition to having you take the mic and reading selections from The Unreal City.
This poem is called The Nudes. I was a figure standing in an indescript space, a staff in my hand, eyes open. My legs apart, my feet pointed outward. I looked happy, I looked ready to be looked at. I was seated, my left shoulder shrugged, my right arm raised in a fist, eyes closed. My left hand rested on a plinth, left buttock on a column, my right hand was open. My upper body turned as I looked to the right, another white wall or window. It was perfect. The pose became mine. The wall, the floor, the window, mine. I raised my left arm, bent it back behind my head, leaning backward, my right hand's fingers grazed my breast just below the nipple. I knew exactly what to do. Was a figure gazing at a viewer from a forest, holding an object, unseen. My foot suspended in water at the bottom of the frame, a goat bent to drink. Was a boy in pale greens squatting on my couch, blue mass to the viewer's right. I lay in a green chair, wrapped in white lace, my knees apart, and there were 12 of us bathing in a pond. I was washing my feet, turning round to gaze backward, as a friend's mouth fell into a man's lap, right foot off center, a cloth hid my chest. My pelvis tilted forward. I leaned back on the bed with the dog, right hand clutched a vase. A black cat, a servant, at my feet with flowers. I was a figure facing a mirror. My body, anyone's living, splayed on the sofa, portrait at work. The legs of the man behind me leaving my room, the sound of his boots. From my ears, the back of my head to my ass, on her stomach, my left arm bent. Spread my legs, held abreast, and the backboard of the bed, gaze up, my dress falling down. Was a woman standing in a doorway. Before me, two figures, one atop another. One man held a leather harness. His free hand rested on or held down the others. There were 5 of us, fingers curled, 2 clothed, 7 of us, 5 nude boys moving through a room. We were both on the bed. I was under a lover's hands. It was worth it for the money. I was standing, shadow down my spine, knees to ears, thighs spread, sagging to the left. The viewer was not. I was lost, not placed, in the infinite seasons of a landscape. Okay, so next I'll read a poem from the middle of the book. This one is called Elizabeth Street, and it's basically a walk from Soho to the East Village, from where I used to work at a photo studio to a soba restaurant I used to go to that now no longer exists. Elizabeth Street. 5 o'clock, I walk out, cross, piss, digit, flip to white, Mercedes horn on Varick or else jubilant, twist left on left or right, foot shift beneath Trump overhang northward, 1 block, spring step, split gap between the hulking, Malcolm D, McDougal 3, some piggish cluster, conflict sculpture, bronze in rain of growth, fuck just beyond which, and no doubt because of neat linen and strapping outfit, paparazzi walls lined up, bellman, flash, shutter, stutter, slip of pant leg, ankle, as it enters, bourbon, white gloves held up, palms turned out, his fingers spread as if to catch post-photo, may say just 1 word, so barely heard and so inflected as to cab, imply a non-obtrusive question to which I have always, except once, said no. So right on spring past Nouveau Riche on vacay, hubbies, gym shoes, loafers, fur-strewn wives and daughters, darting eyes, the clueless firstborn baby son's hands smooth and bald, up like fat ducks to 6th and spring at stop the signal, bottlenecking no less than 6 gorgeous humans gleam in sunset off each other, lightly I stay south, cross 6th, past Aqua Grill with You like, no, but thank you. Opposite the Tascars, outside Doms, and old men Vesuvios, scarf hot slices span time wasted, watching Soho's women glide by as I long stride loose in condo shade or curbside of the scaffold, outside dash in Georgetown Cupcake, Vogue's House Evolution, Broadway's Faux Pashmina, Balthazar. They took Blaine's cards down off the ceiling, Crosby Street, Lafayette Triangle, Time, De Salvio, Jean, Lombardi's Pizza, Just Shades Mott, the leather goods store, Stick With Me, left on my favorite blocks, these four to walk, Elizabeth, established 1755, stretched up to Bleecker, 1816 now. If ever I have cash or reader loaded, you might find me live on this street of my patron-funded dreams past 1-1 Spring, Marini, Manchi, Lee Red Craig Vandebule, Pure Projects Peasant, Coupon Spree, The Valley Nails, Erica Tano, Noleton Hotel, Corporate Office, Liz Street Garden, Public Daily, Gawker, Cinemagic, Blue Moon, Holland, Sherry, Bespoke Gallery, and Sandro, Helmet, Lang, Bredelis, Maria, Bonita, Salon, Spa, Vince, Hotel of the Rising Star, Red Flower, Eunice, Cafe Abanak, Kit 228, and Stephen Allen, Leila Boe, Sop, Claire 5, Shot NYC, Me and Roe, Albanese, Rudolph, Annette McCarthy, Thomas Sayers, then Todd Snyder, City, Jim Fair, Anya Ponarovskaya, Atelier, Cologne, Suck, Hop Tea Shop, Ivana Helsinki, Bedhead Pajamas, House, Long Distance Movers, Toy Sport, and Wolverine, The Agent by Agent, Provocateur, Kit Ace, Manhattan Postage, Nautico, and Bobble Fair Area, Ivy, Musket Room, Tacombe, Thompson, Marine, Layer, Love It, Dorn, and Bucket Deep, and Alex Millip, straight through Houston. Rag and Bone and Tom and Jerry's, Chef Chevet, Midi, my NYC birthday in Soho Court, Parisi, Siggy's, Good Food Art Salon, SSUR, Patricia Field, Comfort Parking, Where If I Won, Mega Millions, Powerball, or Are You Loaded? Always found a way to get the conversation started. Would park my Toyota, never sell it. I sold it. Never wear suede duster, no shit kickers, no, never buy a fur, always remember where one comes from, unload chandelier from floss, a teakwood, 8-place, dining table, linens, mattress, bed frame, headboard, selvage jeans from APC, 3-piece suits, Howland sweaters, wine fridge filled with vintage, JV Beckers, thanks Amanda, pay for Ubers from my friends from Queens and Brooklyn to come stash a private jet, or Hitachino, send him home with rent, then right on Bleecker, Cortino, Bottega, Harmony, Bianca, Von, Madame Geneva, think Saxon parole, and left on Bowery, where a shaded gaze, my lasso's eyes from thrice above my pay gradation, sidewalk slumps as if to diss or reminisce the shitty 4 blocks up and 1 block east past second, storefront window, in which due to fate of sorts, pluck strings of buckwheat, where I meet my baby and Bob Curry talks of Lou and John and Merson, Laurie Anderson, Rashawn Mitchell, Ruff Lemon, Silas Rayner, Jonah Beauclair, Robert Wilson, Sophie Callis, Cinda Childs, David Byrne, Kim Eno, Ivo Van Ho, Ragnar Jartenson, Spalding, Gray, Phil Glass, and Suzanne Vega, Marcy Munnerlin, and Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Wallace, Sean with Deborah Eisenberg, and Larry Pine, and Curry. When's the run? Until I order, checking, truly, leader, roaded, what's the run? If I won Powerball, Mom, quit your job. Let's catch them all this season. Just this season, Sake with Elvis Hermanas, Wendy Whelan, Mikhail Baryshnikov, David Newman, Doug Elkins, Mark Morris, Uliana, Lopetkina, Anna Jenny, Ivanchenko, Leslie Manville, Nathan Lane, Glenn Bronca, Brian Denny, Matthew Marshnoma, Dunas Wenny, Alessandra Ferry, Daniel Beatty, Stephen Petronio, Juan City Flamenco, Nicholas Van Young, Annie B. Parson, Paul Azar, George Lewis, Robert Ashley, Andrew Anish Koch, Vanessa Ansva, Becca Blackwell, Aaron Landsman, Daniel Clock, and Luke George gotta catch them all. Look up, dude. Ain't no Charizard or Mewtwo. I just speak on this street and the Leeton life on way from work to baby and Bob Curry. There you are, dear Soba Ko, my salty savior. And the final poem I'll read is 1982. Which, again, is a poem about a painting I would have liked to paint if I had been a painter, although I didn't paint it because I am not a painter. 1982. Out like fireflies from the interdimensional, silver discs at edge of picture hover over Hillary with swaddled child, John Podesta counterposed beside her, in a painting I'd like to paint, had I been a painter. Trading in detail from the too smooth desert to the figures, ships descending from the upper left, bending off the corner in sun glare through lens flare, a cyan, azul, up cerulean sky, quote, driven by a power obtainable at any point in the universe. That's Tesla, 1889. Before our second TV star turned chief commander's uncle John G. Rifle do his papers, marked his work a failure. Down a road at lower left, behind a fence and warning sign, an open door and down an elevator, sugar bunker. A room in which a coil runs a current without genesis. An engineer safety checks the PFM machine. And they light up on radar. radar, beacons from another world, one in which we might imagine, but fail to, caught up as we are in particulars, the curtain falling once again, mutual assurance that even if they're probably just sucking up samples of atmosphere, testing, waiting, confirming, they loom, strangers, a mirror to our fears. The Earth is dying. It's 1982. Atmospheric carbon hovers like a threat above 340 ppm. 1,700 red pins dot a vintage map behind a concrete tunnel. Through an open door, two patients dragging ivy cords, their areola punctured by the saintly gestures of their fingers. Fluttering white patients' gowns hung open in inverted V's, as Washington, center-left, face a doofus mimic of an elephant seal bull's full-grown proboscis. His tricorn's elongated shadow falls over a pipeline shaft, fails, crossing no river. His glass-bottomed boat casts a circular wake in sand. 7 gleaming Series 800 Terminators in long blonde wigs, desert wind, alternate rowing, then smoking, ruby eyes piercing their liquid mercurial shine, which recasts our gaze on the blue of the horizon, the ships and the landscape's gradient falling, Topelico, vermilion, rust, a crushed, flipped, smoldering Mercedes C250 coupe, engine projected and burning in the sand in front of ballroom, Gipper spits, gap tooth, thistle grin, legs right on Thatcher's lap, draped inside the AIDS quilt, head rung with a halo reading Hollyweed. Opposite ARA Santissima Trinidad run aground, far left, troops pouring ant-like from a hatch, their bayonets shearing in ribbony elision through a redcoat division, who, as they fall, hold high a Union Jack rendered translucent by the ice-white sun. 2 children shimmer on InfoWars, royal blue right sleeves emblazoned with the Rothschild coat of arms. Kim Jong-un, Ali Khamenei lean over a chessboard as W looks on in a flight suit at himself off the board under Khamenei, ears falling floppy and pink from beneath a yellow beanie on a TV in a second-story window of a tower at Mentmore Towers, dead center. Outside in clocklight, just below the putting green, self-portrait hunched over a desk by a window, its frame askew, shade pulled, half buried in desert sand, through which thick snow falls across 2 surveyors, ExxonMobil patches on their highway yellow parkas, bent over, measuring flow. Above them, upper right, background of the middle field, 3 A-10 warthogs fly strafing runs, dark green, blending almost perfectly into mountains sfumato, aided by jet wash and their gun smoke's gray blur. 3 a.m. on the clock by the MacBook lying open on the desk on which a YouTube frame frames a mini Mentmore. 1855, its date sold 5 years back to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Transcendental Meditation 501c3 Foundation Maharishi, which hosts the English glam band Roxy Music, on location filming promo for their single Avalon. It stars an 18-year-old Sophie Ward and singer Brian Ferry. 9 cut roses on a table left to right beneath the cherry blossom. Pink, pink, white, pink, pink, white, white, pink, red. The first note petal like a piece of skull in drift off edge of table on the wind in Mentmore, Avalon, as 3 old women seated backs to 2 6-foot arrangements. Right arm of the white tux Ferry's wearing, catching sun, his mic half raised, are smoking. Much communication. On the floor, the band is in emotion. Ward, her face, then cut, the single red rose cupped. White feathers top her heels as a hooded falcon stands beneath an empty table. Samba takes you out of nowhere. Ferry forward. Ward looks up. She twists. He licks his lips. The background's fading out of focus. Shadows roil over face. The picture's changing every moment. Down the stairs, your destination. Do you know it? You don't know it, do you? Calla lilies top a 5-foot mantle on which pulsing light and zoom shot grope the statue's bare left breast. Ward enters through the doorway, turns and lifts her arm as Ferry follows. Drummer close up, 3 busts, Falcon, hooded, lead guitar, sax, bassist, dancing. When you, bossa nova, there's no holding. Fairy lifts his hand to touch her shoulder. Ward looks past him, rises, hand turned down in echo promo poster for the film E.T., a child's hand above a half-lit planet, finger contacting a being. Ward, her back in shadow, turns, the lights fade up, the women lean in slowly. Avalon, as into English light, the saxist steps out, 8 notes, bass continues. Falcon, flying rightward, lands on Fairy's arm, and even though we know her trainer whistles, as he brings her down to face him, wind through hair and feathers, I get shivers as they turn together toward the camera. Fairy's bangs fall down his face, the Falcon's feathered cap and straps like thistles blowing, treed moors, blurry distance, 82. A veiled bust hangs off old Mentmore, sacked, and pink-tooled Ward spins on in darkness, cross the empty dining hall before the waiter. Backup singer sings the same 2 notes as English light from English sun shines through the Mentmore crown. She drops the scale, and the Falcon, reaching for the red rose, misses. Fairy downcast, like the crushed opponent for the second time, we're told that those folks crossed the seal-backed Bering Sea, hold up the curtain. That was rent from top to bottom, like the playbook says, and falling over greening pole, the ice cap left and draped a dish in contact with a. Ward is steadfast at the camera. Cut. She spins, then slows, reverses. Past the waiter's blinding tray, he stands there, underpaid and left behind. Her pink tulle spins alone. In full disclosure, hear the clip I'm watching, YouTube, 3 a.m., Fort Collins, winter 2017. Cuts off a moment short, so now the party's over, which is when the story changes out of nowhere or refuses to move forward. In this painting that I might have painted, had I been a painter, exercise and failure, dressed as Western, never painted, never sung, and never taped it. Watch the red line end. For London gentlemen, play 18 holes at Mentmore, swinging down the green for par returned in time, the Sons or State.
Wow. That was awesome hearing you articulate these poems in audio form after I had read them on the page. And that leads to one of my last questions. In my discussion with Olivia Gatwood a couple of years ago, we talked about how poems take multiple forms, how the poem is read on the page by the reader, how the poem is heard when performed and in front of an audience who probably have never read the poem. How do you approach preparing a poem to be recited that employs strong visual elements on the page? Elizabeth Street being an example, I was very curious to see how you would approach, what decisions you would make to read it. And you had this acceleration momentum and almost speeding up and couldn't get out the words fast enough, and the challenge of breathing. Even as my mother's an oboe player and as a woodwind instrumentalist, you have to think about breathing a lot so that it doesn't interfere with the lines of music. So how do you approach preparing a poem to be read in front of an audience?
I think, so much of my writing process is about like reciting the poem, or my editing process really is about reciting the poem to myself and thinking through in that like sort of internal recitation, did I leave something out of the written poem that actually can just be cut out? And unconsciously I cut it out in reciting it to myself. Is there something that I'm getting stuck on that points unconsciously to a problem in the poem that I need to think through? So I'm like constantly having this like, when I'm working on a poem or poems, I'm having this like internal experience of like hearing them or reciting them to myself internally. And like that often sort of points to like the kind of like musical goal that I have with the poem. That's something that like in performance of the poem, I try to like really bring out. My favorite way to experience poetry is reading poetry. I'm actually like not that fond of giving readings. I think that rather than getting up on stage or whatever and just like reading a poem to the audience, which feels like a little like stuffy, the poem should be like performed. The poem should be interesting orally in its own right, as well as on the page. So I just try to like do something that feels fitting for like the subject matter and the form of the poem and like have fun with it.
Well, poet, songwriter, and jazz singer Lisa Marie Simmons, who I interviewed a couple of years ago, is a good friend of mine, is a perfect example of that. Like, her performance, partially because she's a jazz singer and musician, but also spoken word artist. She knows how to perform a poem versus just reading the poem. So absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, finally, what are you working on now?
Well, I actually just moved, and I'm like sort of I haven't like set up my apartment, so I don't have a very good writing space. So I'm sort of taking a little break from writing. But I think once I get back to it, I have a manuscript of sort of slant translations of Catullus. There's a few in my first book, Exit Theater, none in the Unreal City, but I kind of returned to that project. So I have a manuscript of those, and then I have new manuscript that I've been working on that is much different than these two books, kind of going back to shorter poems and trying to take this idea of, rather than writing in first person and assuming that a reader kind of wants to like inhabit my perspective towards some poetic end, trying to think of a way more to like create a world or an experience that a reader can just step into without me, which is it's been taking up a lot of my thought. So that's kind of the goal of my new project.
Tremendous. Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today.
Thank you so much, James. Really great to speak to you.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast and spread the word with your poetry community.